Currently, Earth.
On August 26, in the year 1346 AD, the Battle of Crecy took place. During the Hundred Years' War, King Edward III's English army annihilates a French force under King Philip VI at the Battle of Crecy in Normandy. The battle, which saw an early use of the deadly longbow by the English, is regarded as one of the most decisive in history. On July 12, in 1346, Edward landed an invasion force of about 14,000 men on the coast of Normandy. From there, the English army marched northward, plundering the French countryside. Learning of the Englishmen's arrival, King Philip rallied an army of 12,000 men, made up of approximately 8,000 mounted knights and 4,000 hired Genoese crossbowmen. At Crecy, Edward halted his army and prepared for the French assault. Late in the afternoon, on August 26th, Philip's army attacked. The Genoese crossbowmen led the assault, but they were soon overwhelmed by Edward's 10,000 longbowmen, who could reload faster and fire much further. The crossbowmen then retreated, and the French mounted knights attempted to penetrate the English infantry lines. In charge after charge, the horses and riders were cut down in the merciless shower of arrows. At nightfall, the French finally withdrew. Nearly a third of their army lay slain on the field, including Philip's brother, Charles II of Alencon. His allies, King John of Bohemia and Louis II of Nevers, and 1,500 other knights and esquires. Philip himself escaped with a wound. English losses were less than 100. The battle marked the decline of the mounted knight in European warfare and the rise of England as a world power. From Crecy, Edward marched on to Calais, which surrendered to him in 1347. On August 26th in 1794, our nation's first president, George Washington, writes to Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, Virginia's governor and former general, regarding the Whiskey Rebellion, an insurrection that was the first great test of Washington's authority as president of our nation. In the letter, Washington declared that he had no choice but to act to subdue the insurgents, fearing they would otherwise shake the government to its foundation. The Whiskey Rebellion of August 1794 was the product of growing discontentment, which had been expressed as early as 1791, of grain farmers who resented a federal tax imposed on their distillery products. As growers threatened federal tax collectors with physical harm, Washington at first tried to prosecute the resistors in the court system. In 1794, however, 6,000 men angry at the tax gathered at a field near Pittsburgh and with fake guillotines at the ready challenged Washington and the federal government to disperse them. In response, Washington issued a public proclamation on October 7th, giving his former Revolutionary War aide de camp and current Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the power to organize troops to put down the rebellion. In his letter to Lee on August 26th, Washington noted that the general populace considered the insurrection with, quote, universal indignation and abhorrence, unquote, and said that he otherwise would not have authorized such a heavy-handed response. President Washington understood that the nation, having only recently violently overthrown the tyrannical English king, was in a delicate state and did not want to appear as an equally despotic president. He waited to see if the insurgents would back down. They didn't. According to biographer Joseph Ellis, in his Excellency George Washington, the aging president mounted his horse on September 30th to lead a force of 13,000, larger than any American army amassed in one place during the Revolution, to quell the uprising. The act of mounting his war horse was brief and largely symbolic. Washington made most of the journey by carriage. Lee joined Washington in the army on its march to Pennsylvania. This was the first and only time a sitting American president ever led troops into battle. Washington abandoned the procession early, however, leaving Alexander Hamilton, the true mastermind of the military response to the insurrection, in charge of the final approach to Pittsburgh. The rioters dispersed in the presence of the federal troops, and bloodshed was averted. In the aftermath, Washington reported to Congress that, although he had agonized about the decision and intended to uphold the constitutional right to protest unfair tax laws, the insurrection had to be put down, or the survival of the young democracy would have been in peril. Congress applauded his decision, but Washington's former Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who was in temporary retirement at his Monticello estate, viewed Washington's decision to call out troops against fellow citizens as a dire threat to Republican ideals and an abuse of presidential power. The uprising highlighted a growing division in American politics. By the end of Washington's second term, this pitted rural agricultural interests, led by future presidents Jefferson and James Madison, against the pro-industrial urban interests, represented by Hamilton and John Adams, and gave rise to the two-party political system. On August 26, 1914, the German Eighth Army, under the leadership of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, strikes with lethal force against the advancing Russian Second Army, led by General Alexander Samsonov in East Prussia during the opening weeks of the First World War. In the middle of August 1914, much sooner than had been anticipated, Russia sent two armies into East Prussia, while Germany, according to its war strategy, had the bulk of its forces concentrated to the west against France. The Russian First Army, under General Pavel Rennenkampf, advanced to the northeastern corner of East Prussia, while Samsonov's Second Army made headway into the southwest, planning to join with Rennenkampf's men and pin the outnumbered German Eighth Army between them. After a Russian victory in the Battle of Gumbinnen on August 20th, however, Rennenkampf paused to regroup his forces. Meanwhile, change was afoot behind the German lines. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, chose to replace the previous leader, Maximilian von Prittwitz, after the latter issued a misguided order for a German retreat to the river Vistula against the advice of his corps commanders. Hindenburg, a retired general of great stature, and Ludendorff, who had just led the German capture of the Belgian fortress of Liege, arrived in East Prussia and immediately authorized an aggressive counteraction against the Russians, previously planned by a senior staff officer in the region, Colonel Max Hoffman. Separated by the great Masurian Lakes, the two Russian armies were unable to effectively communicate with each other as to their movements, a circumstance that would prove deadly. Though Ludendorff succumbed to nerves initially, delaying the start of the German attack by one day, Hindenburg was able to calm his subordinate, not for the last time in what will become a fabled partnership. On August 26, after intercepting unencoded wireless messages from both Samsonov and Rennenkampf, the Germans were able to take Samsonov's army by surprise with the force of their attack near the village of Tannenberg to the southwest of the Masurian Lakes. The delay in starting the attack had given Samsonov's forces more time to advance deeper into the sack formed by the German divisions and closing on them from both sides, the strength of which Samsonov consistently underestimated. After 3 days of battering by German artillery, Samsonov's troops began their retreat. More German forces cut off their path, and a massive slaughter ensued. In the first hours of August 30th, confronting the reality of his army's collapse, Samsonov went into the forest away from his staff and shot himself. In total, over 50,000 Russian soldiers continued their eternity, and some 92,000 taken as prisoners in the Battle of Tannenberg, named thus by the Germans in vengeful remembrance of the village, where in 1410 the Poles had defeated the Teutonic Knights. By the end of August, Russia's ambitious advance in East Prussia in August 1914 had achieved at least one of its goals, albeit at a tremendous cost. 2 German corps had been removed from the western to the eastern front in order to confront the Russian menace. Though the 2 corps had not arrived in time to play a role in the Battle of Tannenberg, which would remain the greatest German triumph of the war against Russia on the eastern front, they would also be unable to aid their comrades at the Battle of Marne in early September, when German forces advancing towards Paris were decisively defeated by British and French troops in a crucial victory for the Allies. The historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on History.com.